ahead and get everything kicked off. So let me just do this real quick. So good evening, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the HRMA speaker series. My name is Dominic Austin, and I'm the co-president of the Human Resource Management Association. And it is my distinct pleasure to be your host for the evening. And we have a phenomenal session in store for you. But before we get things kicked off, I want to start with a few announcements. So the first one is we have the Cal SHRM case competition that's coming up in April. And we've participated in it the past 2 or 3 years. I know last year we actually won the competition. And so this year, if you are interested in participating as a volunteer, or if you're interested in being a part of the debate team or being a sponsor, please reach out to us via email, which we will put into the chat right now. All right. So next, unless anyone has any questions, we want to do take a photo and also share our handles for social media so that you can find us if you have any questions or you just want to stay up to date with our activities. And then if someone wouldn't mind, one of my fellow board members just taking a good clean photo of all of our participants today, that would be great.
Dominic, I think to take the photo, you have to stop sharing so that way the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's okay, I made the same mistake last time too.
Okay. There we go.
Does anyone want to take the photo on the board?
So,
Okay, sure. I can take it then.
okay.
If you are comfortable turning on your cameras, that's totally, if not, that's totally okay. Let me go ahead and get this ready. Okay, in 3, 2, 1.
Got it.
Got it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So, oops. All right. So now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Theresa Haskins. I have had the pleasure of taking a course with her. She's an organizational development and disability inclusion leader with decades of experience working for corporations, nonprofits, along with educational institutions to develop leaders and create inclusive cultures where diverse groups of people thrive. She's also the CEO of Haskins Consulting Group, a neurodiversity inclusion company that helps individuals and organizations identify and achieve their goals for learning and improved performance. Theresa is also head of global talent program and change management at JP Morgan Chase. In addition to being an advocate for neurodiversity, she continues to research autism and neurodivergent employment issues to develop solutions that enable employers to build more disability inclusive and accessible organizations. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Haskins.
Thanks, Dominic.
You bet.
Good evening, everyone. So tonight, in the time we have allowed, we're going to talk about neurodiversity at work. And thank you, Dominic, for the nice introduction. One of the things I'd like to start with is to really start framing up as HR professionals, which I'm going to guess most of you are, or at least aspiring to, what does it mean to say neurodiversity at work? And why is this an important construct to start thinking about as we build more diverse workplaces? So the first thing I always like to think about is when we say diversity and you say diversity, and the leaders in your organization say diversity, who are you intending to include? I want you to think about that and think about the current diversity initiatives that you either support or see advertised in your company. While all important, most diversity initiatives are focused on gender inequities, racial inequities, ethnic inequities, and sexual orientation. And while these are all worthwhile pursuits that we need to address, it doesn't support and often isn't at the table of the discussion of disability inclusion. Disabilities make up 25% of the world's population. So it's a significant area to be absent at the table. The second thing we need to think about is when disability is part of the diversity conversation, it's almost always in relationship with constructs that we can build in the physical domain. So we think about lifts and ramps to access buildings. In more recent times, we think more about technology, maybe captioning for deaf and hard of hearing, screen readers and voice to text technology for those that are blind. But what we really haven't thought about and really don't equate to is what about the variance in terms of how people may engage differently in the world, where constructs such as a ramp or a lift are not going to be enough to ensure that they have access and inclusion in your organization. And as HR professionals, to really start challenging, is diversity variance in people, or is diversity variance in thought, communication, and thinking about new ways of working, new ways of structuring work so that you actually have what we all say we aspire to, diversity and experience, innovation, and creativity. And this leads us to why neurodiversity. There are so many disabilities that can inform the future of work and technology. As I already said, we already know that it is because of deaf and blind individuals that we have a lot of the technological advancements, including this Zoom call today, and the keyboard that you use to type your login with. Disabilities have informed many of the technological and physical world enhancements that we take for granted. Neurodiversity is the next step. And the reason why neurodiversity is so important is twofold. On the right side of the screen, which probably should be the left-hand side of the screen, we have a talent shortage. We have a generation of boomers and frankly, Xers that are aging. And the new population, there's not enough of them to actually replace them. We have over 54% of businesses reporting skill shortages. Not that there aren't enough people that want to be employed, but not enough people with the skills to fill the jobs. At the same time, we have an issue with an increased rate of autism diagnoses, as well as other neurodivergencies, which we're going to talk about. Why this is important is today, one in every 44 8-year-olds is diagnosed with an autism diagnosis. That means in 10 years, a decade, which it's probably going to take to build the constructs to support them, we'll have one in every 44 18-year-olds with an autism diagnosis. People who today struggle to obtain and retain employment, but actually have the mental capacities to do so. So if you're wondering, well, where are we at today? We're about one in every 122 people have an autism diagnosis. And what's concerning is today about 75% of those autistics are unemployed. And of the 25% that are employed, they're underemployed, which means they are not in jobs commensurate to their skills and abilities, or they're not making a wage commensurate to their abilities. So we have this opportunity. We know that we need talent, and there's this population of people that are getting more education and more vocational opportunities, but they're not able to obtain gainful employment. So that's why neurodiversity. You notice I'm not saying autism inclusion or ADHD inclusion or Tourette's inclusion. And it's because neurodiversity is pushing past the deficit and disability standpoint and is really looking at how you create the workplace of the future. What if you take one thing away tonight, it's the idea that neurodiversity includes all of us. Neurodiversity is not the neurodivergence. It is the inclusion and appreciation that there is a diversity of human brains and our minds, and that infinite variation of how we interact with the world. So autism, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, they would be what we would consider neurodivergent. Some people say neurovariants, some say neurominority. But what we really want to take away that these are people who were born with brains that function differently than the normative population, nicest way to put it, and their behaviors and how they communicate and how they process information in the world deviates from what society has said is normal. Where neurotypical is the neurocognitive, are normative behaviors, and folks that have the ability to adapt and adapt to normative ways of thinking. So when we think about just some of the norms of cultural things, neurotypical people tend to adopt them, and they tend to be able to do that more readily. So a little bit more about neurodivergence. Neurodivergence is what informed the need for neurodiversity. Research showed that folks with autism, dyslexia, Tourette's, ADHD had difficulties and were often excluded from typical environments. And that went from being put in separate special education classes, not being part of the general education population, to today struggling to be part of inclusive competitive environments, and albeit well-meaning, the creation of separate and maybe not so equal always autism at work programs. And this is because neurodivergent employees sometimes have issues with executive functioning, social interactions, right? How they talk, how they engage, how they're interpreting the situation, how they communicate, how they structure work. One of the things that I always want to highlight, though, is by nature of how our society is, we tend to take a deficit lens. But where we're missing a huge opportunity is there are strengths in everybody. For every deficit somebody has, that deficit can lead to an innovation that allows that person to be able to do things in a new way. So when we look at neurodivergent people, we actually find that their differences and sometimes some of the deficits that actually lead to diagnosis in childhood turn into strengths as they grow up and move into adulthood. So a child who may have a hyper focus with trains and overly myopic attention to specific items will grow up to have extremely high attention to detail, which leads to thoroughness and accuracy. The ability to focus on one thing in our multitasking culture and society. Very keen observational skills, and an amazing ability to absorb and retain facts. It's interesting because oftentimes you'll see autism listed as a cognitive disability. It is not, it is a cognitive difference, because most research shows they actually have better retention and memory than neurotypical individuals. What we learn is that as you read through these things, we find that their difference, because it's so narrow, ends up being a strength in certain areas. And so we know that to overcome obstacles, that's where innovations and novel approaches come from. That is the catalyst to creativity. That builds tenacity and resilience, somebody that continuously has to overcome obstacles. And they tend to have high integrity. And these are all things that we want in employees. whenever I read through this slide or talk to people, they hear this, but they don't, because it's not how we think about people. I see a chat. Okay. So what happens, unfortunately, is even though I can tell you that there are people with autism, like my son, who has an exorbitant memory, who's 16 years old and doing calculus 3 in college. When I tell you he's autistic, this is still where everybody goes. They go to the impacts. They go to the deficits. They don't care that he can calculate the trajectory to the moon. They're worried about his atypical body language and stimming, his tendency to engage in repetitive behaviors, his difficulty engaging in small talk, and trouble keeping up with traditional conversations. One of the things that's very concerning and why disability inclusion and neurodivergence is the area that we really need to focus on the most is when you look at these items, you need to understand that these items are not something you can overcome. They are not something you can fix for the individual, because these boxes reflect criterion that is actually the disability. Let's say that again. These things that you are reading on the screen are the criterion that will determine whether or not somebody is autistic or is ADHD. So if you have somebody that has trouble keeping up with a conversation or difficulty interpreting what others are thinking or feeling, that is the disability. There is no amount of therapy or supports that is going to change that. To try to change that would be like you as a leader or an HR personnel trying to help somebody who has told you they are blind and they cannot see. I say this because we want to be really thoughtful when we have inclusion programs that say we're having neurodiversity at work or autism at work, that we're actually setting up the construct for these people to be included with their disability, not despite it. And if you have a program, which some of the autism at work programs do, that lasts weeks to determine whether or not these autistic qualities or neurodivergent qualities will not interfere with their ability to do work, then you really aren't creating a path for neurodivergent inclusion. So you may be saying, so Dr. Haskins, how do you do this? Well, when we focus on the deficits, we're focused on the medical model of disability. And what that does is looks at the individual and says, I need to be fixed to fit in with society. I can't be successful if I can't engage with the world the way others engage with the world. And that would be the only model to success. So, for example, the medical model of disability says, I can't join a webinar because I'm deaf. But I and many others know that it's not all on the individual. Is the disability disabling you from participating and working and living? Or is how society constructed the job or the construct keeping you from fully participating? The social model of disability would say that you're not able to attend because the webinar did not provide closed captions. This flips the script in terms of the onus and the deficit being on the individual with the disability and turns it to what society or the leaders or the organization's expectations and constructs are that would enable or deter success. Let's do another one. I can't complete the form without assistance because I'm blind. Once again, my inability to engage is because of my deficit and my disability. The social model says that the company didn't provide forms electronically with screen reading technology. One implies a path to success, and it is a partnership with others that gets me there. We're going to do two more. we already are familiar with this one, can't attend a meeting because we can't walk upstairs. Thanks to the 1970s, forward thinkers and policies that made universal design for architecture a requirement. That's usually not the case. Because the truth is it's not that you couldn't attend a meeting because you couldn't walk upstairs. It's because the building didn't have adequate access to those floors. And most of us couldn't imagine being in a skyscraper without an elevator today. So this leads us to, but what about the things that Dr. Haskins was talking about, where they don't communicate the same as us? How do you manage that? Because that's how we communicate. Well, here's an example of a very common request on accommodation for an autistic employee or candidate. They'll say, I wasn't hired. They took too long when they responded. They rambled when they were answering questions. They don't fit here. The social model would say that the employer refused to provide questions and set expectations before the interview with the candidate. I'd go so far as, does it matter if it's somebody rambles when somebody answers a question? Are you hiring them to be a public speaker? When we start to really unpack the constructs of what is required in a job versus what we've become accustomed as normal engagements and interpersonal interactions, it starts to really help unpack how we as a society disable people from inclusion, not because they are actually disabled from contributing to our workplaces and our world. So the social model of disability, even though I know we're talking about neurodiversity tonight, it's an important thing as HR professionals to understand how you may be contributing to the exclusion of people who would otherwise be capable if your constructs were accessible. So the social model of disability is defined as the loss of opportunities for people with physical, sensory, social, or intellectual impairments to participate in work or in ordinary life on an equal level with others due to structural and social barriers. So most simply put, the social model explains the loss of opportunities due to structural and social barriers. Because when we have a ramp, people with mobility issues can enter. And what we have learned over the last decade is that there are social and structural barriers that are keeping neurodivergent employees from entry as well. So, as any disability, there is variance in terms of abilities and skills, but there's variance of abilities and skills in all human beings. But what we're talking about is the inclusion of neurodivergent employees who meet the required skills due to education and other requirements. We're not talking about hiring somebody that is less, but hiring somebody who may engage differently. Common accommodations for neurodivergent employees that we see in competitive knowledge working environments are often quieter work areas. Maybe more time for completing work. Sometimes they require peer review or quality checks of more detailed work. They may need flexible work time to accommodate periods of focus and attention. Notice I didn't say flexible work arrangement. I'm just saying that maybe your company likes to have meetings at 8 a.m. because that's how you've always done it, and then you work the rest of the day. Maybe your neurodivergent person needs some time to acclimate when they first get to the office. Maybe meetings would work better at noon. Maybe they'd work better for everybody at noon. We rarely ask. And then the last part is just writing down instructions, deliverables, training materials, and setting expectations. That oftentimes helps people with executive functioning issues, which might be organizing works, time management. By the way, I think most of us do better when these things are in place. And so these are often common accommodations that are requested. Most of them seem reasonable, but oftentimes they're met with concern. For those of you that are familiar with education, the concept of giving a student more time to complete a test has often been met with a lot of pushback. And this is because people have a hard time understanding the difference between equal and equitable. And then I'm going to push us to accessibility. So the standard workplace and the standard education environment tries to treat people equally. This is how things are set up. This is what worked for success. This is how we structure our work. Here is how we hire people. This is how we conduct interviews. In this first image, it's assumed that everyone benefits from the same supports, the same constructs, and therefore they are being treated equally. And they are. They all have the same size rock. But we can see that in this picture, they're not all the same size. And so while two of them can see over the fence, which is the objective, to see those mountains, one person's view is completely obstructed. So while it is equal treatment, only two of the three can meet the objectives, and therefore only two of the three are able to do what is required. Most companies are doing a better job with workplace accommodations. So if and when somebody needs something, when they disclose their disability, when they say, oh, I have ADHD, I need a support, then we're willing to give them an extra rock. We're able to give them a lift so that if you need a support, you can get the support. And then there's an equitable outcome in the sense of everybody can meet the objective to see the mountain. And while we have an equitable outcome, it is not an equitable scenario because some people have to put themselves out there in ways to get an accommodation that they need. And we're going to unpack that a bit here in a second and think about why somebody should have to disclose for an accommodation anyway. But at the least, they can get it. What neurodiversity and what the social model of disability really challenges us to start thinking about is, are accommodations good enough? What if we actually looked at the scenario systemically and thought about what's really happening here? And what's the objective? Is the objective to see over a fence, or is the objective to see the mountain? When we really think about creating accessible workplaces, we start to think about how we can create systems and processes that remove the barrier so that an equal environment is also an equitable environment and it's accessible to everyone. So in the third picture, we see that the fence has been removed because the goal was to see the mountain, and now no accommodations are required, and we all have the same path to get there. That is what neurodiversity informs. That is what universal design informs, and that is what you as HR professionals need to start really thinking about. If we have a lot of people asking for an accommodation, if we find that we're continuously, routinely trying to create constructs for people to see over the fence, at some point you need to determine, why is the fence there? And is it an obstacle that can be completely eradicated? So I'm going to go back. One of the things that I was thinking about before I came here tonight is, as HR professionals, we really want to think about our need for disclosure. If we really have an increase of people with neurodiverse conditions growing in our communities and disability on the rise, part just because of our aging workforce, we do want to think about what we could do to create a more accessible workplace. We know today that disclosing a disability and self-identification is low, and that people will only disclose their disability when they absolutely must have a support for an accommodation. And while that sounds okay, the thing that bothers me the most, well, there's a lot of things that bother me, but here's a few that are opportunities, I think, for all of us to help overcome. The first is during the interview process, when we say things like, oh, he was great, but he kind of walked around the question, or he sounds smart, but I don't know if he would fit here. If we go back to this list of differences, let's get there. If you were interviewing this person, do you think you'd connect with them like you connect with other folks? If their disability is interpersonal communication, but you're hiring them to be an accountant, does it really matter if you connect? The other thing that bothers me is sometimes after an issue has happened with a neurodivergent employee in the workplace, people will say, well, if Bob had told me he had ADHD, I would have helped him. I want to ask, why would we be more willing to help Bob if we knew he had a disability? Why can't we just help Bob if he says he needs help? Why are we more accepting of differences if we find out they're autistic? Why can't we just be accepting if Lucy acts different? And I really want to drive that point home because it is a bit concerning if you have empathy and compassion for somebody you think has a disability. Is that because you think that they maybe in some way are less? And we want to be really careful to check that we aren't actually exposing an implicit bias. Neurodiversity requires us to unpack all that. If you create a neurodiverse, supportive workplace, you would be willing and ready to support people regardless of whether they not have a disability. Because there are 5 things that are required to support neurodiversity at work. And when these are in place, disclosure becomes less required. The first is teams that focus on strengths and creating diversified teams. It's something that we all say we strive for. I've rarely seen it. Focusing on strengths is just that. What is the strengths that you bring to the table and ignoring the deficits? And creating a diversified team is really counter to most job requisitions I've seen. But do you know who's great at creating diversified teams? Orchestras, rock bands, sports teams. How often do coaches or conductors seek team members with the exact same skill? Rarely, right? They want the best pitcher, they want the best catcher, they want the best field people. A band wants a drummer and a guitar player and a saxophonist. There are definite deficits if you think you're going to measure them all with the same stick, but if you focus on their strengths, you create this diversified team. What if you have a drummer that can't carry their drums, but the bass player might? And if we think differently about what's required to drum or what's required to be part of the workforce, we open the door for more strengths, diversification. The second part that's really important, and I also think is missing oftentimes, is being really clear on the expectations, being very clear and direct with communications, and supporting performance and task assignments. How many of you have met with leaders or even been through job interviews where you are asking for clarity on the role and they couldn't articulate it? Our neurodivergent friends need clarity, being that they communicate differently and they process tasks differently. If you can align them to objectives, they can do the work. If you could be clear, we could all better understand. And that's why neurodiversity works, because I would say 1 and 2 benefits neurotypicals as well. Number 3, and it seems so simple, is just following up with employees with meeting notes and reminders. I don't know how many of you have been on meetings where people can't remember the date 2 days later. The other thing is there's some managers that don't like to give employees reminders. I told Bob once, why do I have to tell him again? I thought we were a team. Why don't we want to support each other and keep everybody on task? So thinking of that team mentality where we're all in together, we collaborate, we support each other, helps keep things moving, which is actually counter to the culture that started to evolve in the 70s and 80s of competition and survival of the fittest. We don't have to cut each other's throats to be successful at work. We could collaborate so that the team all succeeds. Number 4, be reasonable to accommodations and novel approaches to work. Most accommodations are denied or resisted, not because of the cost and the expense, but the perception of equity and the perception of fairness to others. The first question I would have is that what the person needs to succeed, and isn't that what we would want? And the second question is, why can't everybody benefit from that accommodation too? We also know that when we have to come up with new ways of working, that's when we get innovative technology, ideas, and processes. Anytime you have to overcome an obstacle, you create a new path to the solution. And that's where innovation comes from. But innovation also comes from the leaders and the team members that make the space for that variance to exist. So you don't have to be the innovator to be the incubator for creativity. Last but not least is promoting kindness and celebrating differences. I think when people read that, a lot of people think they do, but do we? Promoting kindness goes back to whether or not we include Bob and treat him with kindness and invite him to lunch or talk behind his back because we didn't know he was autistic. Promoting kindness means we're kind to people regardless of whether or not we know there's a disability involved. And we celebrate differences in the uniqueness that makes humans so wonderful to begin with. None of these things are easy. All of these things require a mindset shift, not of the disabled individual, but of the peers that surround them. When we do these 5 things, we create psychological safety, collaboration, and productive teams. And that's why we are focused on neurodiversity and not any specific autism, ADHD inclusion, because we understand that this construct doesn't just create an entry to inclusion of neurodivergent workers, but it actually creates a healthier, better employee experience and stronger company overall. So we know neurodiversity works. We know psychological safety is a catalyst to strong teams. We know that adaptive leaders are the way of the future. We know that if we can find ways to get leaders to think about objective, strength-based talent management principles and work to create cultures that are accommodating and flexible, we know that neurodiverse employees can help address the talent gap because they have the skills we need. We just have to make the space for them to be included. We do know that autism inclusion specific programs did improve autistic employment outcomes. And when they were part of inclusive competitive teams with their neurotypical peers, we saw increases in innovation, productivity, and work quality across all the employees. It isn't just attributed to the diverse or divergent individual. It impacts the entire team. And that's something worth investing in. The most important thing as you being HR leaders is if you learn how to adopt these principles and embed neurodiverse methodologies into your organization, into your practices as your standards, it increases your adaptive capacity to drive systemic change. Because what we're talking about takes intentional effort. We're not just talking about a new system or a new technology or a new architectural construct. We are talking about a seismic shift in terms of how we think and behave and treat each other. And if we can make those changes, we open the door to support diversity across all demographics. Because unlike gender discrimination racial discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, or ethnic discrimination, disabilities is discriminated by all of us, all of them. And when we create environments that can actually appreciate and support and celebrate diversity of thought, diversity in communication, diversity in approaches to work, diversity in work structure, diversity in interpersonal interactions, and just different ways of thinking, teams that can include that variance show to be more inclusive of all demographics because they tend to be more psychologically safe, open-minded, and accepting. So, trying to watch the time. To promote neurodiversity, step 1, educate yourself, which today's a first step, but there's a lot to learn. I think it's great to learn more about each unique neurodivergent, to see how autism may present, how ADHD may present, whether there's procrastination issues, whether they may be more likely to tick or stim. But because it is such a spectrum, the truth is if you meet one individual that says they're neurodivergent, the next person, how it manifests within them will be very different. What really matters is that you're aware that these differences are immutable and part of that person. You will never be able to therapy or coach them or mentor them out of being who they are and how they process information in the world. They were born that way. But what you can do is educate yourself to understand what those variances may be and to respect that those differences do not disable that person from working and being successful. That is, those are constructs that are disabling them, not the actual disabilities themselves. We want to focus on access and how we can remove the barriers so that we create pathways as unique as they may be. Be open to new approaches. And it's funny because we're like, oh, absolutely. And some of my students are on the line. I like to make the joke, have you ever gotten a disagreement on how to load a dishwasher or how somebody was cleaning the house or the right way to fold a towel or how to fold a shirt? And if you've ever had that, this is the right way to hang the toilet paper roll, then you may not be as neurodivergent inclusive as you would think, because the goal isn't about doing it your way. That's your success, sure. But the goal is getting the dishes clean, folding and putting away the towels, hanging up toilet paper so it's there when you need it. Does it really matter which way it's hanging? Does it really matter if the towels are folded in squares or rectangles or rolled, dare say? And when you're truly open up to new approaches and you don't get stuck on my way is the way, then we open the door for opportunity. When we can, we want, and just so you know, it's the human way. And so we actually have to catch ourselves and be, oh, we're ready to go to that next plane of enlightenment, of acceptance of multiple ways to success. We want to implement universal practices when we can. Universal practices like having quiet areas for everyone, having technology that helps organize work, making it a standard to follow up with meeting minutes, having clear objectives and goals. It sounds so simple. It's often missing. Another universal practice would be granting accommodations without justification. More people may ask. More people may get what they need to succeed. I need a step stool to reach the dishes in my house. I don't think that impairs me from cooking. Most importantly, We need to advocate proactively for inclusion. One of the things that sometimes people say is that, well, we don't have anybody with neurodivergence on our team. Well, A, you don't know that. And B, if you didn't take this away, you can create the constructs to make yourselves more ready to include those with neurodivergence before you actually have anybody. If you start rethinking about how you include and who you include, if you start thinking about focusing on objectives and not how things have been done before for success, if you start creating a culture of psychological safety, if we start calling each other out quickly when we find that people may not be included or there are comments being made that are about variance in being or approaches, if we start working in the ways that accept the bit of variance that already exists amongst ourselves, you will begin to create the frameworks that you will need when you get somebody in that maybe approach work profoundly different than you. So advocate proactively for inclusion. Start looking around to see where you may already see barriers that, if omitted, might actually be a catalyst to open the door for new opportunities, for new talent. I'm going to pause because we have 9 minutes to the end, and I'll stop sharing to see if we have any questions, Dominic.
I have a question. My name is Marty and I work in talent acquisition.
Hi, Marty.
One of the things that you mentioned was, I'm a little confused about a couple of things, but the one you mentioned was that if we had known that they were neurodivergent, we would have done something differently. We would have helped them. Should these individuals be telling us that they have a neurodiversity disorder or issue? I mean, should they come out and say, you know, here's my strengths, these are the things I'm great at, you know, like you said, the attention to detail, but what I need help with is sometimes they don't always understand what you're telling me to do. I mean, how should these people address that to a hiring manager?
So Marty, what I'm proposing is that the individual, so we have the current state and the future state. So let's delineate that. The future state, because neurodiversity does not exist today. That is the future state. Okay. So in the future state neurodiversity, a manager should be open to the conversation of accommodations and variance in working as the norm. Okay. This is so different than how things are today. So today, for somebody to get accommodations, they usually have to have documentation to prove they have a disability. You have to say, I'm autistic. And then once I tell you that, you're willing to help me. But that's not neurodiversity. That's disability accommodations. That's saying I, as a manager or as a company, will only help you if you can document a deficit.
Well, we don't want to know that information. We want to know what they need.
Right. But today, in our current construct, people only ask for an accommodation and it's implied with an impairment. Neurodiversity would imply that we create constructs that are automatically disability inclusive. So today, if you're autistic and you want the questions beforehand, you have to ask. My retort to that is, why are we not just providing candidates with questions beforehand? What are you measuring when you spring a question up during an interview in real time? Is everybody studying to be a debate lawyer? Is everybody, right? Like, what are you hiring for? Is your interview and your mechanisms to hire people actually assessing the skills, or just perpetuating what we've been taught is the interview process? There is actual training on LinkedIn that will teach you how to answer an interview question right, how to phrase your responses in a way that will be palatable to a hiring manager. I didn't know I was training to interview. I didn't know I was going to be a professional interview in the job. I thought I was being hired to be an accountant. Neurodiversity requires us to look at what are we doing? What are you measuring? Is your process even assessing skills? Or are you perpetuating an extroverted communication framework as entry into your organization? What I'm talking about is seismic. This isn't something we go in tomorrow and just go, oh, here's a little modification. We're talking, but by the way, when universal design for architecture was implemented, it was seismic. No new buildings could be put in without lifts or ramps. And I came from a small town. You would have thought they were removing arms because of the modifications banks and things had to make. And it took decades. They had decades to fix it. We have decades, but we need to fix it. We know that traditional interview processes are not actually getting us the most talented employees. They're getting us the best speaking employees. So it requires clean job architecture, understanding of objectives, working with managers to understand skills, and rethinking things. We say people don't have to disclose their disability to get an accommodation, but in our current culture, if you asked for an accommodation, you've already disclosed you had a disability. That's what we need to unpack. And if we know as hiring managers that there are folks with disabilities, right? Like a lot of people do better with closed captioning. Why not just make that standard? It's available on all the Zoom. We know that most people do better when they're prepared. Why can't we give them prep beforehand? If they're qualified, the questions will show themselves. Is even a question answer format the best way to assess that candidate for that role? And the concept of neurodiversity starts to unpack that. Look, I'm so bold is my son, we talk to his professors. They send him his work, we organize his work. Are you ready for me to come to an interview with my son? You'd probably be like, well, no, but why? I thought you needed him to calculate the calculations to the moon. Wouldn't he have a manager that could organize his work and tell him what calculations that needed to be done this week? This is what I'm talking about. Hiring people for the actual skill. He may never be able to have this conversation we're having today. He can do things I can't even begin to explain. So that's how profound of a change I'm talking about. We have people that cannot get through the interview process because they don't communicate the same. They are not going to say hello. They do not make eye contact. They have a double doctorate. I actually know these people. They can't get through. And they don't lie. So when you say, have you done this before? They'll say, no. Can they tell you what a differential equation with whatever they say that? Yep. So are they qualified for the job? We could spend a week unpacking this. But the first step is understanding that our constructs of who we include and how we include is all based on extroverted normative constructs. It's who can give the best presentation, who can say it the way we want to say it. And that's what's hard. The other thing that's also concerning, and I know we're at time, Dominic, the other thing that concerns me is we sometimes leave it on the individual to tell us the accommodation they need. If you're autistic, we call it level 1 autistic, so that would be traditional autism on the DSM-4, not Asperger's or some of the others that are also not part of autism. I don't know if they would even know what accommodations to ask for because they don't work there. They have their disability, their deficit social communications. Do they know how to tell you how to support them? I don't know. Not all blind, like I know deaf employees that don't ask for sign language interpreters because companies are not amenable to that. The people in the deaf community that I know, they do not like captioning. They would rather have an interpreter. How many of you are providing those? Would they even ask? Would that be considered a reasonable accommodation outside of the US government, federal organizations? So these are the things that we really need to unpack. And the only way to do that is to better understand their experience in relation to our own. Because the goal is inclusion. We work together. And they will never be us because they're not neurotypical and they're not seeing and they're not hearing or whatever other disability they have. And we will never know what it's like to be blind or autistic. And we have to work together to understand what is it with the recruiting process? What is it with the interview process? What is it with how we're managing talent? What is it how we're managing work? Where is the gap? Where is the similarity? And where can we find a universal path forward together? For years, that graphic I showed you used to just be the fence and then the fence with the rocks and like, see, equity and quality. It took like a decade before somebody said, why don't we remove the fence? So if you're giving accommodations, that is the first step. Figuring out a way over the fence is the start. But at some point, you want to step back and go, what's the real barrier here? And that's what neurodiversity starts to highlight. That's what my experience has been working with neurodivergent individuals, that we're often focused on individual accommodation. You do that accommodation enough times, you start asking, why don't they just caption all videos in education? Why is that a separate accommodation every semester? And that's where you start finding your systemic opportunities. And then they wouldn't even have to ask for the accommodation because it's part of the system. And that's what I mean by system. I don't mean technology, just system as society. I hope that answers your question. It's a lot to unpack. It's not, so we're talking about seismic shift in terms of how managers view people. Right. But that's where we start. If we can get people to appreciate that it's different and be willing to work with differences, then we can actually talk about what that looks like. Otherwise, we'll continue to other each other and have ableist views in terms of capabilities. We never want people to do things because they think, oh, he needs a support. That person that needs the support might actually be better at the job, the task that you're hiring for. So,
Wow.
Dominic, I can talk all night. You're going to need to stop me.
Dr. Haskins, that was phenomenal as usual. Really, really appreciate you taking out some time on a Monday to visit with us. So many key takeaways. I took a couple of screenshots that I'll definitely be piggybacking, on my interactions with my team moving forward. So thank you very much for your time and your passion for neurodiversity.
I'm just glad that you're all here today. Thank you, Marty, for raising the questions. I mean, my first answer is, oh, that's a hard one. Do we have an hour? But the truth is every step matters and exposure matters. That's why, as much as I'm not in love with autism at work programs like I used to be, how important they are to show people the skills and capabilities these individuals bring, because they deserve it. And any acknowledgement of capabilities is a good step forward. And then the next step is to just not need those type of programs. But affirmative action programs exist for a reason. We need an entry, right? We have STEM for women, we have autism at work. These programs help get people in the door. And so while those programs are running, I'm running to build the back end so that we don't need those programs. In 30 years, I don't want DEIA leaders. We just want leaders that do it. That's my
Absolutely.
dream goal. That's maybe my lifetime.
I'm with you on that goal. Well,
Thank you
thanks
for your time. I
again.
really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
we certainly appreciate it. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Dr. Haskins, thanks again. Will certainly be keeping in touch throughout my journey. So we certainly
they say.
appreciate it.
Fight on.
Right
Thank
on.
you. Have a good evening.